As I look out, I see some empty spots throughout the auditorium. In addition to those in our journey, we have several who have just the old colds that you get here in Middle Tennessee. Kyle's home today sick. I see Joel's out. He's been sick for a while, and you may see others scattered around. So in addition to those in our journey, please remember those who are just fighting these old spring colds. Also, we had in the journey that Christy Buck was having surgery tomorrow. That's actually February the 25th. And so if you please take note of that, that gives you an extra week to pray for her, and I'm sure she'd appreciate all the prayers we can lift up to her. What a blessing it's been so far this morning. I mean, from the moment Kenny started singing and the beautiful text that Stan read, Jim's thoughts as he led us before the cross, the songs, being led in prayer by one of our shepherds. I've just been so encouraged and uplifted already. And I hope you have. I hope you have. As we finish up our series today on the book of Galatians. But before I do that, I want to tell you a quick story. It was the summer of 1976. I was a teenager in high school, and my mom and dad were going out of town. I'd called up a friend to say, would you like to come over and spend the weekend with me? And he said, sure, would love to. And we had planned in particular to go down to a creek behind our house, about a half a mile. There was a little creek down there, and a bunch of us from church would go down there from time to time, and we would just play all kinds of wonderful things you do as teenagers in that creek. I mean, we would play King of the Hill, and we'd try to dunk one another, and we just had enormous fun playing down there at that creek. Now, there was one little bitty problem with that. The creek had spots that were well over your head. And number two, none of us could swim. All right? Well, we're teenagers. We're invincible. What could happen to us? And so, anyway, I go over to my friend's house, who just so happens to be the preacher's kid. All right? And I pull up in my Datsun pickup. I honk the horn. He comes running out. I say to him, do you have your swimming trunks? And he says, yes. And we're excited. And as he's getting into the truck there in the preacher's home's driveway, his mother shouts out from the house, hey, Farrell. What, Mom? Whatever you do, don't go swimming. He gets in the truck. I back out. He goes, what are we going to do now? I said, what do you mean, what are we going to do? He said, Mom said we can't go swimming. Now, I was preparing to be a preacher even way back then. I turned to Farrell and I said, do you know how to swim? He said, no. I said, I don't either. There's no way we can violate her command. So the next day, we get up, we get our swimming trunks on, and we head to the swimming hole that none of us can know how to swim in. And we're just so excited. We're going to get to go down here and spend some time in the water. And so we park the truck out where nobody could see where we were, and we get out, and we go down, and as we climb into the water, y'all know what a horsefly is? Horseflies are these big old giant bugs that can eat you alive. Well, there was a dairy farm nearby, and evidently every horsefly that lived at that dairy farm descended on us. And we're in this creek fixing to jump in, and these horseflies start attacking us. And we get down in the water, and we're trying to duck under the water, but they're landing on our head. They're biting us on our backs. I mean, I finally said, man, we got to get out of here. And so we jump up. We climb up the hill. These horseflies are following us. We run to the truck. We jump in. We have to roll up the windows. They're hitting the windshield. And we're looking at each other going, you don't think God did that, do you? And we went home, and that was the end of our swimming career. Now you say, Leslie, why do you tell that story this morning? because that preacher's kid's sitting right yonder. He did it to me. Farrell Hester is here today. Farrell and his wife Lynn took a day off. Farrell preaches down outside of Corinth near Pickwick, Tennessee, and had an opportunity to come and be with us. His dad was our preacher when I was growing up, and his granddad was a preacher. His brother's a preacher. His brother-in-law's a preacher. All of his uncles are preachers. If preaching ever goes out of style, their family's in trouble. That's for sure. But it's always a pleasure to see Farrell, and to have him to visit with us today is a great blessing. And I could tell a lot more stories on him, but unfortunately he can tell a lot on me. So, Farrell, I'll keep my mouth shut if you'll keep your mouth shut. All right? Paul's finishing his letter. He started writing, I think, as he was on his way to Jerusalem after he and Barnabas had made their first missionary journey. They had planted new churches all through what is today modern-day Turkey. And they had gone to little towns like Derbe and Lystra and Iconium and another little town called Antioch. And they had started these new churches made up mostly of Gentiles. Now, Jews there, but mostly of Gentiles. Paul and Barnabas had traveled back to Antioch in Syria, and there they were celebrating, this first great victory of going out and preaching the gospel to the Gentiles, when word comes that some people had followed them. In fact, they showed up at Antioch real soon, and they were known as Pharisaic Christians. And what I mean by that, they are Jews who have obeyed the gospel. They've put their faith in Jesus. They've been baptized. But they had been Pharisees before doing that. And when they came into the faith, they brought their Pharisee tendencies with them. And so as they hear that Paul and Barnabas are going around and preaching and establishing churches among the Gentiles, they follow them. And their message is a very simple message. What Paul and Barnabas are telling you is right, except it's not complete. If you truly want to be pleasing to God, not only must you believe in Jesus, but you need to be circumcised and you need to keep the law. Now, boy, that had brought Paul and Barnabas into a massive conflict with one another. And so Paul pens this letter, I believe, as he's on his way to Jerusalem. In Acts 15, we read about that conference, and he's going to finally deal with it with James and with Peter and John and the rest of the elders down there. Now, he's been arguing all the way through that it's faith in Jesus Christ and not circumcision that sets you apart unto God. And as he gets to the last chapter, he begins to summarize a very important point. You see, one of the charges these Pharisee Christians made against Paul was because Paul emphasized grace so much, Paul was encouraging people to sin. And so Paul addresses that. Now you see here the Romans charge. This is the same basic thing that he has to do in Romans. What then shall we sin because we're not under law but under grace? And Paul says, if you think I believe that, you're crazy. By no means is that the way it's supposed to be. And so he says that is not what God has called us to do. And so notice here in the last part of chapter 5, you, my brothers, were called to be free. And he emphasizes it. But don't use your freedom to indulge the sinful nature. Don't do that. In other words, you don't use grace as an excuse to sin, but instead you love one another. You serve one another out of love. And coming out of that, he recognizes that law by its very nature creates conflict. And it created conflict there in the churches of Galatia. You say, Leslie, what do you mean? Well, think about it for a moment. Anytime you live in a legalistic system, conflict is a natural result from it. We live in one here in America. We have laws, and we're expected to abide by those laws. But guess what happens when we don't? We end up in court. We've all seen people in court cases where you got lawyers on either side, and what are they doing? They're arguing about how you interpret the law. And if you think that is common in American culture, you should have seen it in Jewish culture. They had religious leaders known as lawyers whose sole responsibility was to parse every little jot and tittle of the law so that people knew how to live and how to act. And Paul comes along and says, do you really want to go back to that kind of system? He says, now don't go too far the other way, but please don't go back to that system. And so he says, so watch out that you don't get caught up into this biting and devouring one another. He says, if you are circumcised, then you have to keep the holy days. Then you have to, you have to keep the dietary laws. He said, if you keep going down that pathway, you're going to end up, every time you come to church, arguing over, are you faithful or are you not? Are you doing what God's called you to do or are you not? And you just got to realize, and boy, he's going to emphasize that in chapter 6, once you start down that pathway, you got to go all the way, except nobody does. He says, so what do you do if somebody is caught in a sin? How do you handle it? I mean, let's say you come to church and you see someone at church. I come and I see Stan here. And I think back to last Friday, I'm over at Kroger, and Stan's over at Kroger, and I see him. He doesn't see me, and I see old Stan take a Snickers bar, slip in his pocket, walk out of the church building, walk out of Kroger. And I think, Stan just stole that Snickers bar. Now, what am I supposed to do? Now, see, if you're a Pharisee Christian, what you do is you get up on Sunday morning and you say, folks, I need to make an announcement. We got a thief right here. And we need to deal with it. We don't need thieves in the church. And so I'm hoping everybody will join with me and we'll drive him out of the church because I saw him steal a Snickers bar last Friday. Is that what we do? I mean, I know of churches that do that. I mean, they're very quick to point out the mistakes everybody's making. Paul begs the churches of Galatia, don't do that. Instead, if you see someone who is caught in a sin, you who understand. Notice that word spiritual there. If you've been following him all the way through Galatians, he's basically saying you've got two choices. You can go with the flesh or you can go with the Spirit. And he says, I hope those of you who are going with the Spirit, that you will treat him the way he needs to be treated, which is with gentleness. Now, coming from the Apostle Paul, that's amazing. I mean, Paul in his previous life was anything but gentle. And yet the older Paul got, the more you hear him talk about gentleness. You turn over to 2 Timothy. This is right before he dies. And he's dealing with false teachers. Look at what he says. And the Lord's servant must not quarrel. Paul knew what quarreling was. He had spent a lifetime learning how to do it well. And yet, after he converted to Jesus, he realized quarreling gets you nowhere. And so he begs the Lord's servant, don't quarrel. Instead, he must be kind. Notice the words he uses there. Kind to everyone, able to teach, not resentful. And those who impose him, gently instruct them. And the reason for that is very simple. Look at the last line. But watch yourself, or you may also be tempted. The point he's simply making is, how would you want someone to treat you if you're the guy who steals the Snickers bar? If you're the woman who takes it without paying for it? Would you want it announced to everybody? Or would you want someone to come up and say, can I talk to you privately? Can I tell you what I saw? I know what you claim to be, and I believe you're trying to be that, but I think Satan maybe's caught you. I mean, that's the language that's used here. If someone is caught in a sin, it's like a trap that's been set by Satan. And Paul is saying if you're caught in that trap, those who are spiritual, treat them the way you would want to be treated. And then notice what Paul does. Paul, I love what he does here. It's like he's throwing a curveball at these Pharisaic Christians. He says, carry each other's burdens. That's what it's all about. And in this way, you'll fulfill the law of Christ. Oh, mistake. You need to get some white out there. Paul didn't mean to say the law of Christ. You see, Paul takes their argument. He says, y'all want to keep law? I mean, your guys are all about law. Let me give you the law to keep. It's called the law of Christ. Now be real careful here because it's easy to say, so what you have in Jesus is you have Jesus' law replacing the Old Testament law. That's not exactly what Paul is doing here. Paul says that what Jesus did was to fulfill the Old Testament law, is to take the law and to make it what God always intended for it to be. You see the same argument over in 1 Corinthians. He says, to those not having the law, I became like one now having the law. And then he put a parenthesis in there, at least we put a parenthesis in there. Though I am not free from God's law, but I'm under Christ's law. In other words, if you'd come to Paul and said, Paul, what is that one guiding principle that you use to basically interpret everything that you do? He would say, it's what Jesus gave his disciples the night he was betrayed. As he turned to them and he said, a new commandment, a new law, a new teaching I give you. And that teaching is simply this, that you love one another as Christ has loved us. You want law? There it is. And Jesus said, if you apply that one, you don't need the 10 Commandments anymore. You don't need all the other commandments that you find in the Old Testament. If you can learn how to live like this, then everything in the law and the prophets is summed up in it. And that's the point he's trying to get across to the Galatians. He says, listen, if you think you're somebody, you got to remember, some of these Galatians have been circumcised, and they're coming to church going, I'm faithful now. You're not. You haven't been circumcised yet, but I've been circumcised. And I'm trying to keep the law of Moses, you know. I mean, I'm trying to do everything that Jesus has called me to do. And Paul says, really? See, the problem with this is you start comparing yourself with others. I'm circumcised, you're not. I'm eating the right food, you're not. And Paul says, is that the way you want to go? He says, listen, we need to test our own actions, and we need to take pride in ourselves without comparing ourselves to somebody else. And then he makes a very important, and I love the way Paul does this. He says, for each one should carry his own load. Now, if you're confused here because Paul had just said we should carry one another's burdens, you should be. Because in one verse, you carry one another's burdens. In the next verse, you need to carry your own load. And Paul's a master of this. I mean, Paul is someone who says, listen, you can take any teaching to an extreme. You see, if we begin to emphasize here, we need to carry one another's burdens, some of us here are going to go, fine, if you're going to carry all my burdens, I'll let you carry all of them. And Paul says you can't do that. We're going to start a series in 1 Thessalonians next week. Some Thessalonians kind of felt this way. I mean, they'd gotten so caught up in the second coming of Jesus, they simply said, we're going to quit our jobs and just kind of live off the goodness of the church. And Paul said, really? Is that how far you're willing to go? And so Paul is constantly trying to balance it out. You see, I'm supposed to bear the burdens that Wayne has, but I'm not supposed to do Wayne's job. You see, you have to be able to decide. And if you want to find out about this, talk to Stan sometime about helping people in need. You know, Paul's fixing to go that direction. He's going to want to talk about helping people in need. And yet the point he's constantly trying to make is you need to help those who are truly in need without enabling those who, if you help them, they don't get any better. And it's that balancing act that we live by. He then switches just almost midstream and says, by the way, I want to talk about paying the preacher just for a moment. I came across that and thought, finally, I get to talk about paying the preacher. And here's what Paul says. Anyone who receives instruction in the Word must share all good things with his instructor. Sure wish you had said a lot more. Sid, that ain't a whole lot of instructions for you elders to go on, is it? Just kind of said, be willing to share. You do treat us right. Amen. His point simply being is those that minister in the Word should be supported by the ministry of the Word. And let me just simply say that Northside's been wonderful in doing that. But that leads him to simply say, where's your focus when it comes to money? Where's your focus? And he illustrates it by saying you can focus on the flesh or you can focus on the spirit. In other words, you can focus on living in this world or you can focus in view of the world that God is creating anew. It's your choice. And if you want to know which one you're living in, look at how you spend your money. It's that simple. Look at how you spend your money. I mean, when you die, can I ask you a question? What will the way you spent your money say about the way you lived your life? And that's the point that Paul simply makes. Don't be deceived. God cannot be mocked. You're going to reap based on how you sow. And it has to do with how you deal with this issue of money. The one who sows to please the flesh from that nature will reap destruction. The one who sows to please the Spirit from that Spirit will reap eternal life. His point simply being, if we live our lives as if this life is it, I've got to live for the gusto that's here, then the gusto that's here is all you're going to get. But if you're wise enough to know that God has called us to something far greater, and therefore the way you spend your money is toward that which advances His kingdom in the world, then you're going to reap eternal life. And Paul comes out of that and he says, therefore let us not be weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest. In other words, if you think, yes, but when is God going to finally bless me? Trust Him. He's going to. He's going to. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those of the family of believers. Paul then takes the pen out of the secretary's hand. Paul very seldom, if any time, wrote his letters by himself. He would dictate them to a secretary. And so Paul at this moment takes the pen out of the secretary's hand and he starts writing on the papyrus his final thoughts. And he says, now, you'll notice now the large letters I'm using. I'm of the opinion it's because of Paul's eyesight. I don't know if other people believe that, but when Paul talks about the reason he had preached there in Galatia was because of an illness, and they would have plucked their eyes out, I tend to still connect those two together. But Paul begins to write, and as he's summarizing it, he goes back and he makes the last argument in the book. And the argument is a very simple argument. He says, I want to ask you a question. Are you going to trust those who are trying to compel you to be circumcised? And he talks about them. That's who he's been addressing the whole time. Those who want to make a good impression outwardly are trying to compel you to be circumcised. The only reason they do this is to avoid being persecuted for the cross of Christ. Can I suggest to you why this is the case? I don't know that I can prove this, but I want to suggest it to you. The Jews were considered by the Romans an odd sort of people. On many occasions, the Romans would try to force them to do something against their faith, and the Jews would literally lay their heads out there and say, go ahead, chop it off. We're not going back on our God. And because of the stubbornness of the Jewish people, the Romans had finally decided we've got to allow the Jews to practice their faith. And so the Jews are considered a legal religion in Rome. Okay? If you're a Jew, you are legally recognized as someone who could practice your faith in the Roman Empire. Now, however, Gentiles are coming in. Gentiles are coming in. And these Gentiles are identifying with a sect of Judaism. You see, at this point in time, if you had asked any Roman, who are these Christians? Oh, they're just a branch of Judaism. But all at once, here comes all of these Gentiles. And the Jews hear that, and they're going, whoa, 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 whoa. If they all start coming in and identify with us as their legal status under the Roman law, they're not circumcised. And the more of them that come in, the more that Rome's going to say, wait a minute. You claim to stand up for your law, but these people are not circumcised. And the Jews are saying, if we let them in without circumcision, we may lose our freedom to exercise our faith here in the Roman Empire. And Paul says that's what's really motivating them. They're being motivated because of fear of the persecution that would come if they truly stand up for the fact that Jesus Christ is not only our Messiah, but He is also the King of the universe. And He says that's why they want to circumcise you. They want to make sure they don't get in trouble with Rome itself. And He says, you know, they don't keep the law. Notice what He says. Not even those who are circumcised obey the law. Yet they want you to be circumcised so that they can boast about your flesh. And He says, you've got a choice. You can boast in your circumcision, or you can boast in the one who died for you, who was raised again, and in whom I take my stand at the foot of the cross. Paul says it's your choice. Where are you going to line up? He says because circumcision doesn't mean a thing. Uncircumcision doesn't mean a thing. What counts is the fact that we serve a God who through the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus has started a new creation, redeeming that which was lost in the very beginning, bringing it back under His control, His will on earth as it is in heaven. That's what God has started, and that's the only thing that counts. And He ends with these words: peace and mercy to all who follow the rule, even to the Israel of God. And then one last dig at the Pharisees. He says, they want to mark you off by circumcision. See, the word mark there is the sign of circumcision. It's what sets you apart. He said, you want a mark? He said, I'll give you a mark. He says, let no one cause me trouble because I bear in my body. I don't know if you remember, but there as He's traveling, they took Him outside the city and they stoned Him and left Him for dead. And He got up and continued preaching the gospel. And that's beside other things that have happened to Him because of His faith. He says, you want a mark that sets you apart? It is the marks I bear in my body of my loyalty to Jesus Christ Himself. What sets you apart? Where do you put your faith? A lot of people want to put their faith in their own ability to do that which is right. Paul says if you go down that road, you'll fail. You can never be good enough. He says, but if you'll put your faith in the cross of Christ, and the one who lived and who died for you, that you might die and therefore live again. If that's where you put your faith, then you have a reason to live. Today, if you've never put your faith in Jesus Christ, if you've never been clothed with Him in the act of baptism, what are you waiting for? Paul has set before us Jesus Christ and Him crucified. He has set it clearly before us. Let us accept that wonderful gift. If you've accepted it in the past, but like the Galatian Christians, you somehow have been deceived into thinking, okay, now that I've accepted Jesus, now that I've been baptized in Him, now I've got to start keeping all the rules again. Can I just encourage you to realize that the only rule that He calls us to, the only law is to serve one another out of love? When we do that, we'll fix everything else. And so if you've been feeling guilty because you've been falling short, we're happy to restore you back to that faith relationship with Jesus Christ. Right now, as together we stand and sing.